In the first week of January 1974, in Gombe Stream National Park on the eastern shore of Lake Tanganyika, in Tanzania, a field team working under the primatologist Jane Goodall watched something that would eventually force the entire scientific world to rewrite what it thought it knew about the roots of war. 6 adult male chimpanzees from a community researchers called Kassite crossed south, out of their own home range into territory belonging to a smaller, splinter community called Kahama. They found a young male named Gotti alone, feeding in a tree. They pulled him down. They beat him for roughly 10 minutes with hands, feet, and teeth, while a female named Gigi charged back and forth around the attack. Screaming, Gotti crawled away afterward. He was never seen again. That was the first confirmed killing of one chimpanzee by members of its own former community ever documented. Anywhere, it was not the last. Over the following 4 years, in a conflict researchers later named the Gombe Chimpanzee War, the Kassite males hunted down and killed every single adult male in the Kahama group, one at a time. In almost exactly the same way, ambush a lone individual while it fed, corner it, beat it until it stopped moving, then leave. By 1978, Kahama no longer existed as a community. Its home range, its fruit trees, its water, all of it belonged to Kassite. Nobody drew a line on a map, nobody signed a treaty, nobody held a vote. And yet, a border had been created and enforced with total and repeated precision, using nothing but memory, coalition, and violence. It didn't even last. Within a year of absorbing Kahama's old range, the Kassite chimpanzees ran directly into a larger, more powerful neighboring community called Kalande, along with a second community called Mitumba, and were pushed straight back out of most of the territory they had just spent 4 years killing to take. The border moved again, because the only thing actually holding it in place the first time was force, and a bigger force had just shown up. For most of history, a border was not a line drawn on paper and respected by strangers who would never meet. It was a relationship, carried in the body, renewed by force, and only as real as the willingness of the people holding it to keep fighting for it. The genuinely strange part of this story isn't that humans eventually learned to draw that relationship as a fixed line on a map. It's how astonishingly recently that happened, how casually the people who did it treated the whole thing, and how thoroughly the entire modern world has since agreed to forget just how recent and casual it actually was. So was Gombe just one violent, unusual chimpanzee community, maybe stressed by the presence of researchers, or crowded by a shrinking national park? For a long time, that was the leading assumption, and it was a reasonable one. Goodall herself, in her 1986 monograph, The Chimpanzees of Gombe, Patterns of Behavior, described how disturbing the discovery was, precisely because it broke the field's working assumption that lethal violence between chimpanzee communities was vanishingly rare, possibly unique to Gombe. That assumption didn't survive contact with a second, much larger study 300 kilometers to the northwest, in Kabale National Park, Uganda, starting in 1998 and continuing for a full decade. The primate behavioral ecologist John Mitani of the University of Michigan led a long-term study of a chimpanzee community at a site called Ngogo, at the time the largest wild chimpanzee community ever documented by researchers, more than 150 individuals. Between 1999 and 2008, Mitani's team documented the Ngogo males killing 21 individuals from a neighboring community. Then, in the summer of 2009, the pattern resolved into something closer to strategy than chaos. The Ngogo chimpanzees moved directly into the 4-square-kilometer stretch of forest where 2/3 of the killings had taken place. Their territory grew by 22%, almost overnight in primate timescale terms. They fed on the fruit trees there. They raised infants there. Here's the part worth sitting with. Mitani published the core findings in the June 22, 2010 issue of Current Biology, and the story didn't stop there. New research from Mitani's team, published as recently as November 2025, tracked what happened to the Ngogo chimpanzees after the expansion and found that female fertility and infant survivorship both increased in the years that followed. The killing didn't just win land. Measured in the only currency evolution actually keeps books in, it paid for itself within a single generation. So what is a wildlife biologist actually looking at walking the tree line at Ngogo or Gombe? Chimpanzees don't have property law. They don't have flags, deeds, or courts. Nothing is written down anywhere by anyone, ever, and yet, standing at the edge of a chimpanzee community's range, a researcher can watch a boundary patrol, a coalition of related adult males, moving in tight single file, unusually silent, stopping to listen at the range's edge, turn back at almost exactly the same spot, encounter after encounter for years. Both sides already know precisely where the line is. Both sides enforce it, sometimes to the death, without a single sign, fence, or spoken word. Field primatologists across multiple decades and multiple study sites describe the same specific behavior. A patrol forms almost entirely of related adult males, walks in close single file rather than the usual scattered feeding formation, stays unusually quiet, stops periodically to listen and sniff the air, and will sometimes climb a tall tree simply to look and listen further out before deciding whether to continue. If the patrol encounters a larger rival party, it retreats immediately, in near total silence. If it finds a lone individual or a heavily outnumbered smaller group, the calculation flips instantly, and the encounter can turn lethal within minutes. It is, in other words, a running cost-benefit calculation about violence, conducted the same way, generation after generation, with nothing written down anywhere to remind the next generation how to run it. That's the uncomfortable starting point for this entire story. The instinct to claim and defend a fixed range using coordinated group violence against outsiders is very likely older than the human species itself. Chimpanzees and humans split from a shared common ancestor somewhere around 6 million years ago. Researchers still argue over the exact number by a few 100,000 years in either direction, but the general scale of it isn't in serious dispute, and the coalition-based, silent, deliberate boundary patrol appears to predate that split, meaning it was very likely already running in the shared ancestor of both species, long before anything resembling a human had ever stood upright. It's worth being precise about which relative this pattern belongs to, because it isn't universal even among the closest living relatives humans have. Bonobos, genetically about as close to humans as chimpanzees are, and separated from chimpanzees themselves by the Congo River roughly 1 to 2 million years ago, show dramatically less lethal intergroup violence in the wild. The primatologist Richard Wrangham, in research spanning decades and summarized in his book Demonic Males, co-written with Dale Peterson, has argued the difference likely traces back to something as basic as food distribution across bonobo and chimpanzee habitats, which shaped how strictly each species needed to guard against outsiders competing for the same resources. The point isn't that violent border defense is some fixed law of nature. It's that the same evolutionary starting point can branch in two directions depending on circumstance. And the direction chimpanzees branch toward happens to be the one that looks uncomfortably the most like a human border war, which raises the actual question this whole video exists to answer. If the instinct to defend a fixed patch of ground with lethal, coordinated violence is millions of years old, why does a border, a genuine, fixed, agreed-upon line, honored automatically by total strangers who will live their entire lives without ever meeting one another, barely predate the great-grandparents of people alive today? Something happened between chimpanzee patrol turns back at the tree line and airport passport control, and it did not happen the way most people assume. The next piece of evidence doesn't confirm the chimpanzee story. It complicates it. If territorial instinct really is a multi-million-year-old inheritance, a reasonable expectation would be that early human foraging societies looked something like Ngogo, scaled up, small, jealously guarded territories, hostile to strangers, defended by force at every edge. The best documented foraging societies of the 20th century tell something closer to the opposite story. Starting in 1973 and continuing for 4 years of fieldwork completed as a doctoral dissertation at the University of Michigan in 1977, the anthropologist Polly Wiesner lived among the Jew Hoansi, sometimes called the Kung San, across the Kalahari desert region of Botswana and Namibia. She was tracking something local people called Saro, a sprawling regional network of gift partnerships, exchanging items like ostrich eggshell beads, arrows, clothing, and tools, not for immediate return, but as a kind of standing, long-term social insurance. The numbers Wiesner brought back are worth hearing in full. The average adult maintained 16 separate Axero partnerships. The range across her sample ran from 2 up to 42. 18% of those partnerships were with people in the same camp. Another quarter reached camps up to 15 kilometers away. But a full third of every adult's Hexero partnerships, the largest single category, reached people living between 51 and 200 kilometers distant. When drought hit one region or a waterhole failed, a family with Axero partners 200 kilometers off had somewhere real to walk to, and, per the custom, a welcome guaranteed on arrival. Now here's why that matters for a video about borders. Specifically, this entire system only functions if territory stays soft, if land access is generous, extended and renewed constantly through personal relationships rather than blocked by force. A family facing a bad year can cross enormous distances and reliably land somewhere safe. That is the exact opposite operating principle of a hard, exclusive, defended border. Wiesner's data and decades of subsequent fieldwork by other researchers working with highly mobile foraging societies elsewhere in the world converge on a broadly similar picture. Land use tends to be organized around fluid, overlapping ranges and reciprocal permission, not fixed lines drawn once and defended forever. None of this means early humans had no concept of territory whatsoever. Wiesner's own later research documented real friction. Individuals who used land or water without the appropriate Axero relationship or invitation could still be turned away, sometimes forcefully, by the people who considered it theirs to allocate. The boundary wasn't absent, it just wasn't fixed, and it wasn't defended the way a Kassite patrol defended the Gombe tree line. It was negotiable, personal, and constantly renewed through relationships rather than through violence alone. Wiesner also documented how deliberately private the system stayed. Hexaro exchanges were typically carried out quietly, without ceremony or announcement, specifically so that no single person, not even a close family member, ever knew the full extent of anyone else's network. Partnerships often began in early childhood, arranged by parents, and were later passed down and inherited across generations the way a family heirloom might be, meaning a person's safety net at any given moment had frequently been under construction since before they were born. Access to distant land in this system wasn't a fixed right attached to a fixed border. It was a debt owed to a specific relationship, built up quietly over a lifetime and cashed in only when it was actually needed. The Juhowansi weren't a special case. The anthropologist Robert Kelly, in his widely used synthesis The Lifeways of Hunter-Gatherers, pulled together territoriality data from foraging societies documented across every inhabited continent and found the same underlying pattern surfacing again and again. Where food and water show up reliably, predictably, in roughly the same places year after year, foraging groups tend to defend fixed, exclusive territories with real intensity. Where resources are scattered unpredictably, shifting from year to year depending on rainfall, migration, or seasonal bloom, territoriality loosens dramatically, and networks like Hexero, spreading risk across huge distances through personal relationships, become the more sensible strategy. The Kalahari, with its unreliable rain and shifting waterholes, sat firmly on the unpredictable end of that spectrum. A border, on this evidence, was never simply a question of how territorial a given culture happened to be. It was a rational response to how forgiving or unforgiving the local landscape was in any particular year. So which is the real ancestral pattern? The chimpanzee instinct toward violent, fixed defense, or the human network built specifically to make fixed defense unnecessary? The honest answer, frustratingly, is both, deployed under different conditions. And figuring out exactly which conditions flip the switch from one mode to the other is where this story actually starts to move somewhere new. In 1970, the anthropologist Robert Carneiro, working out of the American Museum of Natural History in New York, published a short paper in the journal Science, 9 pages, that is still assigned in university anthropology courses more than 50 years later. Carneiro was chasing the exact question the last chapter left open. If soft, negotiable territory works perfectly well for foraging societies, what specific conditions force a population to switch to something harder, fixed land, defended borders, and eventually government? Before answering, Carneiro spent a portion of the paper ruling out the explanations that were popular at the time. One camp, sometimes called the voluntaristic view, held that early people simply chose to unite into larger political units for mutual benefit, something like a handshake agreement scaled up to an entire society. Another camp, the so-called hydraulic hypothesis, argued that organizing large-scale irrigation projects was what forced small farming villages to merge under central centralized control. Carneiro dismissed both. Voluntary unions of independent, autonomous villages, he pointed out, essentially never show up in the historical or ethnographic record, because there's rarely a good enough reason for a self-sufficient community to give up its independence without being forced to. And large-scale irrigation projects, in most of the places states first emerged, appear to have developed after centralized government already existed, not before it, meaning the irrigation system was a consequence of the state rather than its cause. His answer was a concept he called environmental circumscription, and he illustrated it with two contrasting regions of South America. In the Amazon basin, farmable land stretched outward in essentially every direction, close to limitlessly. When a village grew too crowded or a feud turned bitter, families could simply walk further into the forest and start over. Political units across the Amazon consequently stayed small and kept splitting apart, generation after generation, Wiesner's soft negotiable pattern, essentially, playing out at village scale rather than individual family scale. The narrow, river-fed valleys running down the Pacific coast of Peru told a completely different story. Those valleys are strips of intensely farmable land, sometimes only a few kilometers wide, squeezed between the ocean on one side and hundreds of kilometers of some of the driest desert on the entire planet on the other. There was nowhere to walk to. The valley was the whole world. When population grew and conflict broke out, the losing side had exactly two options: submit to whoever had won or die in the attempt to resist. There was no third option of simply disappearing into open land, because open land didn't exist nearby. Later fieldwork backed the model with data. The archaeologist David Wilson's 1983 excavation study of Peru's lower Santa Valley, one of those same environmentally circumscribed coastal strips, documented exactly the pattern Carneiro's theory predicted: smaller villages consolidating under increasingly centralized authority over time, boundaries hardening from something informal into something enforced, and rulers emerging specifically to administer land that could no longer be walked away from when things went badly. This is the hinge point of the entire video, so it's worth stating plainly. A border does not harden because a population becomes more tribal, more possessive, or more naturally violent over historical time. It hardens the moment running away stops being a viable option. Open, forgiving land produces open, forgiving boundaries, more or less indefinitely. Circumscribed land, boxed in by ocean, by desert, by mountains, or simply by other groups of people who have nowhere left to retreat to either, produces hard boundaries fast, and, according to Carneiro's model, produces the first governments, whose entire founding purpose is to enforce exactly those boundaries. Coastal Peru is one example among several Carneiro pointed to, but it happens to share its underlying logic with the very first place in the entire archaeological record where a border between two human political units was ever formally written down, and that place has its own version of the same geography. The floodplain of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the earliest Sumerian cities took root, was itself a narrow strip of extraordinarily fertile, irrigated land hemmed in by open desert on both sides, close enough to the Peruvian pattern that the comparison isn't a stretch. Crowded, circumscribed, and, per Carneiro's model, primed for exactly the kind of conflict that produces a formal, defended border rather than a soft, negotiable one. Which brings the story to the oldest border dispute humanity ever bothered to put into permanent writing. In the region of southern Iraq that ancient historians call Sumer, two city-states named Lagash and Umma sat on opposite sides of a narrow strip of prized, irrigated farmland the Sumerians themselves called the Gui Dina, roughly the edge of the plain. Sometime around 2450 BC, a long-running dispute over that single strip of land escalated into open warfare, and the king of Lagash, a ruler named Eannatum, won decisively. What Eannatum did after winning is the actual point of this chapter. He didn't just claim victory and move on. He commissioned a stone monument, a limestone slab reconstructed at roughly 1.8 meters tall, showing his soldiers marching in a tight phalanx formation directly over the trampled bodies of Umma's dead, with vultures shown carrying off the severed heads and limbs of the defeated in one of the monument's most striking registers. Archaeologists today call it the Stele of the Vultures, and it is widely regarded as the oldest surviving war memorial anywhere on Earth. The reverse side of the same stone shifts registers entirely, showing the city's patron god, Ningirsu, holding a large net in both hands, with the tangled, miniature bodies of Umma's defeated soldiers trapped helplessly inside it, an unambiguous message that the victory on the ground had already been decided in advance, in the divine world, before a single spear was thrown. But the stele was never only propaganda. Its cuneiform inscription, badly weathered but legible enough to translate, records something much closer to a binding legal document, the specific boundary line agreed to after the war, and a formal, sworn oath from the ruler of Umma never to cross that line again, on pain of divine punishment invoked in the name of the god Ningirsu. Eonatum then had physical boundary markers, the earliest known kuduru, or boundary stones, installed directly into the ground along that agreed line. The inscription goes further still, recording an annual tribute of grain imposed on Umma as ongoing reparation for the original aggression, which means the settlement wasn't only about where the lines sat. It was about who owed what to whom, indefinitely, for having crossed it in the first place. Here's why that single detail outweighs the battle itself in importance. For the first time anywhere in the archaeological record, a border stopped being purely a fact enforced through memory and violence, the chimpanzee model, essentially, that opened this whole video, and became something written down, formally witnessed, sworn to under religious penalty, and physically marked in a way that outsiders and even future generations who had never personally fought the war could read and were expected to obey. The fragments of the stele of the vultures were pulled out of the ground starting in the early 1880s by the French archaeologist Ernest de Sargec at a site called Tello, ancient Girsu, with additional fragments recovered in excavations through 1889. All 7 surviving pieces now sit inside the Louvre, in Paris, roughly 7,000 kilometers from the farmland dispute that produced them. A boundary invented to settle an argument between 2 Mesopotamian farming towns 4,500 years ago is at this very moment, on public display behind protective glass in the middle of one of the most visited cities alive today. The idea Eonatum pioneered, a border as a written, sworn, physically marked institution rather than a defended memory, didn't stay unique to one dispute between 2 cities. Over the following 1,000 years, it spread, formalized, and hardened considerably. Starting around the 16th century BC and continuing through roughly 1155 BC, the Kassite dynasty that ruled Babylon began producing kuduru by the hundreds carved stone boundary markers recording specific royal land grants, complete with precise inscribed measurements of the plot in question, the names of official witnesses, and a stacked column of divine symbols invoked specifically to curse anyone who dared to move the stone or later dispute the boundary it recorded, a sun disk for the god Shamash, a crescent for the moon god Sin, a star for the goddess Ishtar, arranged like a row of official notarizing stamps that no ordinary human authority could override. Dozens of these kuduru have survived to the present day, scattered today across museum collections including the British Museum and the Louvre, and together they represent an entire bureaucratic culture built on one core premise: land boundaries needed to be permanent, transferable across generations, inheritable, and enforceable by something considerably bigger and more durable than whoever happened to be physically standing on the land at any given moment. This is roughly the historical hinge where a border stops being a fact specifically about 2 groups of people who personally know and remember each other, the chimpanzee model, the Eonatum and Umma model, and starts becoming a fact about a place itself, true regardless of who currently lives there, defended by an institution rather than by a living memory. A kuduru does not care who the current farmer happens to be. It outlives him, and it is designed specifically to. That single shift, a border enforced by people who personally remember why it exists, evolving into a border enforced by an institution that requires no memory of the original dispute at all, is arguably the single largest step in this entire story, larger even than the leap from chimpanzee to human. It's the step that makes everything that follows possible: cities, empires, and eventually, nations made up of millions of people who will never once meet each other, all nonetheless respecting the same line. And this is exactly the point where most retellings of this particular story simply stop land, ownership, kings, stone markers in one clean, continuous upward line toward the modern nation state everyone already recognizes on a map. It's a satisfying story, and it would make for a perfectly reasonable place to end a video. Chimpanzee instinct, softened by human networks, hardened again by circumscription, formalized in stone by Eonatum, industrialized by the Kassite bureaucracy, and presumably refined ever since into the neat, colored map on a phone screen today. Clean, continuous, upward, there's only one real problem with it. It's wrong, or at least badly incomplete, and the actual correction, once it's laid out, changes almost everything that follows, including what a border even is by the time the story reaches the present day. In 2017, the political scientist and anthropologist James C. Scott published a book through Yale University Press titled Against the Grain, A Deep History of the Earliest States, built on decades of research into the earliest Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Chinese states. And it directly overturns the clean version of the story told so far. Scott's central argument is this: the earliest states were never really organized around controlling land in the first place. They were organized around controlling grain, and more specifically, the people who grew it. Grain, unlike root vegetables, unlike most wild foods, unlike almost anything else early humans ate, ripens visibly above ground, gets harvested all at once on a predictable schedule, and stores for months at a time without spoiling. That single combination of properties makes grain uniquely, almost perfectly, easy to tax, confiscate, and ration from a central authority, which is precisely why it became the economic foundation underneath the walled cities, temple bureaucracies, and standing armies that historians typically point to when they say the first states. But grain agriculture required something else too: a captive, sedentary labor force that stayed put on the land, generation after generation, instead of walking away. This directly overturns a much older, comfortable assumption: the idea that agriculture was simply a superior lifestyle early humans naturally chose once they discovered it, with walled cities and government following automatically as a kind of reward for the upgrade. Skeletal evidence from early farming populations tells a less flattering story: shorter average height and worse dental health compared to foraging populations living in similar regions at similar times. Grain farming, for the people actually growing the grain, was very often a harder and less healthy life than the one it replaced, which raises an uncomfortable question about how so many people ended up doing it anyway, and stayed. Which meant early states spent an enormous amount of their actual administrative energy not on drawing lines around territory, but on preventing their own farmers from simply leaving, walking off into the surrounding marshes, hills, and forests where free. Non-agricultural populations kept living, hunting, fishing, and foraging for thousands of years after the first grain states had already appeared right next door. Scott describes the populations living just outside early state control not as primitive, but as people who looked directly at the walled grain state, its granaries, and its tax collectors, and actively chose the unwalled alternative instead. Scott's broader point is that an early state functioned, administratively, much closer to a livestock operation than to a landowner. Census records, ration lists, and labor rosters, not property maps, were the paperwork that actually mattered to a Bronze Age bureaucrat, because the entire fragile system depended on knowing exactly how many taxable, farmable bodies were currently inside the walls, and stopping as many of them as possible from simply disappearing into the surrounding wilderness during a bad harvest or a harsh new tax. A state that lost track of its farmers lost everything. A state that lost track of a few kilometers of unfarmed scrubland at its edge lost essentially nothing, which is exactly why nobody bothered drawing a careful line around it. So what did an early state's actual outer edge look like? Physically, on the ground, almost never a line. Early Mesopotamian and Egyptian states functioned much more like islands of genuinely intense control, a walled city. Its irrigated fields, its granaries, its garrison, surrounded by a wide, fuzzy zone in which royal authority thinned out gradually with distance, the further someone walked from the palace, until, at some entirely unmarked point, it simply stopped mattering at all. There was no fence at that point. There was no sign, no marker, no line. There was only a gradient, fading the way a radio signal fades with distance rather than switching off in an instant. Eonatum's stale, from 2 chapters back, one very specific, unusually formal dispute over one strip of exceptionally valuable irrigated farmland between 2 adjacent competing cities was precious precisely because it was the exception rare enough to carve permanently into stone. It was never the general rule for how early states typically handled the edges of their own control. For most of the ancient world, across most of its recorded history, there simply wasn't a line to defend in the first place. There was a center of power, and everything beyond it was just, in an entirely literal sense, further away. Which raises the obvious follow-up question. If most of the ancient and even medieval world operated on fuzzy fading zones of control rather than hard lines, when did the fuzzy zone finally become the hard, fixed line everyone alive today takes completely for granted? The version where a single person can stand with 1 foot in one country and 1 foot in another, at a spot marked identically on every atlas, every map app, and every official document on the entire planet? The single answer most frequently cited by historians and political scientists is a pair of peace treaties signed in 2 neighboring German cities, Osnabrück and Münster, on October 24, 1648. The negotiations themselves had dragged on for 4 years, involving 109 separate delegations at various points, split across the 2 cities specifically because the Protestant and Catholic sides refused to negotiate on ground controlled by the other. 2 treaties came out of that split table, the Treaty of Osnabrück and the Treaty of Münster, together simply called the Peace of Westphalia. The 30 Years' War had just killed, by most historical estimates, somewhere around 8 million people across Central Europe, a catastrophe driven partly by religious conflict between Catholic and Protestant powers, and partly by the tangled, overlapping jurisdictional claims of the Holy Roman Empire, where one specific patch of land could simultaneously owe partial loyalty to a local prince, a regional bishop, and the emperor himself, with genuine, ongoing confusion over whose law actually applied where and when. The Peace of Westphalia did not invent the modern political map overnight, and it would be inaccurate to claim it did. But it formalized, in written treaty form, a principle historians and political scientists now refer to, somewhat loosely, as Westphalian sovereignty, that a ruler's authority over a clearly defined territory should be treated as exclusive, and that outside powers, including, notably, the Holy Roman Emperor himself, had no automatic standing right to interfere in what happened inside another ruler's own borders, particularly on the specific question of religion. It's worth being honest about some genuine scholarly uncertainty here before moving forward. Historians and political scientists still actively argue about exactly how much credit 1648 deserves for what came afterward. The political scientist Andreas Osiander published an influential paper in the journal International Organization in 2001, arguing that much of what people casually call the Westphalian system is closer to a founding myth, retrofitted onto the treaties centuries after the fact by later international relations theorists, than an accurate description of what the diplomats physically meeting in. Münster and Osnabrück actually agreed to, at the time, the Holy Roman Emperor, for one clear example, retained plenty of real, formal authority over imperial territories that a truly, fully sovereign territorial system would never have permitted. That specific academic debate is genuine, and it remains unresolved. But the logic holds together well enough for what happens next. What is not seriously disputed, though, is the practical outcome across the following century. European mapmakers and rulers increasingly began treating a border as something a physical line could accurately represent, continuous, exclusive, and, crucially, sacred enough that crossing it without invitation became, by itself, an act of war, entirely independent of whatever was actually happening on either side of that line at the time. That is a genuinely new idea in human history. For 4,500 years, dating straight back to Eonatum Stale, a boundary had been something 2 specific neighboring parties negotiated directly, about one specific piece of land they both actually needed and used. After 1648, at least in principle, even if not yet fully in day-to-day practice, a border started becoming something closer to an abstraction, sacred by definition, everywhere, all at once, whether or not any 2 particular people on either side of it had ever met, spoken, or negotiated a single word. Here is where the story takes its final, and by a wide margin its strangest, turn. Because a sacred, abstract line, treated as a fixed and total principle, is a wonderful idea right up until the exact moment someone decides to apply it to land they have personally never visited. On November 15, 1884, the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck opened a conference in Berlin, gathering representatives from 14 nations, including, notably, the United States, whose interest in the proceedings was limited strictly to trade access rather than territorial claims, to formally sort out competing European ambitions across the entire African continent. The meeting continued, with a break over Christmas and the New Year, until it concluded on February 26, 1885. Over the course of 104 days, fewer than 20 men, seated around a single horseshoe-shaped table in one room in Berlin, established the legal ground rules for dividing an entire continent, the overwhelming majority of which not one of them had personally set foot on. The historian Thomas Pakenham's widely cited 1991 account of the conference describes the process in plain terms. European representatives negotiating borders almost entirely from maps spread across tables, with the actual terrain, rivers, existing kingdoms, and language communities on the ground treated as secondary details, to be sorted out later, if they were addressed at all. The single number that makes the true scale of what happened land hardest is this. In 1884, the year the conference opened, an estimated 90% of the African continent still remained under the direct control of local African rulers, kingdoms, and communities. By 1902, 18 years later, not even a single full human lifetime. An estimated 90% of the same continent had passed under some form of formal European colonial control. It is a genuinely strange thing for so much of modern political identity to rest on, once it's worth pausing to consider that the men doing the actual dividing needed nothing more than a ruler, a pencil, and a working knowledge of latitude and longitude. Not a single visit to the region in question. The conference's own General Act made the logic explicit through something it called the principle of effective occupation. A European power could only claim formal, internationally recognized ownership of an African territory if it could demonstrate enough administrative or military presence there to defend and govern it, at least on paper. In practice, that turned colonization into a competitive race, since a claim sitting unenforced on a map counted for nothing against a rival power willing to actually plant a flag and station a garrison. The 90% swing that followed wasn't a side effect of the conference. It was the conference's rules working exactly as designed. Straight-line borders, drawn with rulers on flat paper by men who had never once stood on the actual ground being divided, sliced directly through existing kingdoms, language communities, and centuries-old trade networks that had, in a great many cases, operated coherently and continuously for hundreds of years beforehand. A large number of the lines separating modern African nations today, specifically the ones that run in improbably straight, ruler-drawn segments across a map, rather than following the natural path of a river, a mountain ridge, or a coastline, are the direct, largely unmodified descendants of decisions made inside that one room in Berlin across a single winter in 1884 and 1885. The western border of Egypt is one of the more visible surviving examples. It runs for well over 1,000 kilometers in an almost perfectly straight line, tracking a line of longitude rather than any river, mountain ridge, or existing settlement pattern. The unmistakable signature of a border assigned by a ruler on a flat map rather than negotiated by two neighbors standing on shared ground, which means the version of a border that feels, to almost everyone alive today, like the most permanent, the most natural, the most like simple, obvious common sense, a fixed line, automatically respected by total strangers who have never met, printed identically on every atlas, every map app, and every phone screen on the planet, turns out to be across the full span of this story. The newest and single most artificial layer of the entire structure. Chimpanzee patrol boundaries are millions of years old. Haxorow's soft, negotiable ranges are tens of thousands of years old, at minimum. Eonatum's sworn, stone-marked boundary is 4,500 years old. The sovereign, sacred line on a map version of a border that currently defines almost every country on Earth is, at most, a handful of centuries old, and across more than half the modern world, barely older than a living person's own great-grandparent. Somewhere, right now, a phone screen is open to a map application, glowing softly with 195 neatly colored shapes, each one edged in a clean, confident, unbroken line. It looks eternal. It looks like it was always inevitably going to look exactly this way. It wasn't, and for almost the entire span of this story, it didn't. As recently as 1900, by most historians' counts, fewer than 50 fully sovereign states existed anywhere on the planet. The United Nations, founded in 1945 with 51 member states, now counts 193, and the commonly cited total of 195 includes a small additional handful of observer states and widely recognized territories. Almost all of that growth happened within a single human lifetime, as colonial empires, including the very borders drawn in Berlin in 1885, broke apart across the 20th century into smaller nations, each one inheriting a line originally drawn by somebody else for entirely different reasons on a map they had never personally walked. In 1983, the political scientist Benedict Anderson published a short, deeply influential book titled Imagined Communities, arguing that a modern nation is, underneath all its official symbols, essentially a shared fiction, a group of people who will overwhelmingly never meet one another in person, who nonetheless agree collectively to imagine themselves as a single connected community, bounded by a border that exists and holds mainly because enough people, backed by enough institutions, have simply agreed to treat it as real. That is not intended as an insult to the concept, and it isn't one. It's closer to a precise technical description of what a flag, a passport, a national currency, or a national anthem actually is, structurally, the direct modern descendant of Ian Adams' steel. A physical, symbolic object engineered specifically to make an agreement that only truly exists inside collective belief feel solid, permanent, and worth personally defending. None of that makes the modern border fake or unimportant or safe to ignore. Shared fictions, once enough institutions and enough armed force stand behind them, function exactly like solid facts for anyone living inside them, which is precisely why people are willing to fight and occasionally die, defending a line that, 4,500 years ago, would have been unrecognizable as a border at all. The fiction is real in its consequences, even where it is invented in its origin. That combination, invented yet consequential, arbitrary yet enforced with total seriousness, is what makes the modern nation-state such a strange object to actually sit and think about, which loops all the way back, finally, to Gombe, a chimpanzee patrolling the southern edge of Kassikella's territory in January of 1974 needed no flag, no treaty, and no map to know exactly where its border ran. That border lived entirely inside the bodies and memories of the specific individuals actively defending it, renewed constantly through direct violence, generation after generation. And it would have vanished the instant those individuals themselves did. A modern national border requires none of that constant, personal, physical enforcement to survive. It holds up perfectly well, even though the overwhelming majority of the people who respect it every single day will go through an entire lifetime without ever once personally encountering another human being actively defending it. That is either the single most impressive act of sustained collective imagination in the entire history of the species, or the strangest, most elaborate superstition it has ever managed to make itself take completely seriously. After 4,500 years, running from one farming dispute in Sumer to a horseshoe-shaped table in Berlin, it remains genuinely difficult to say which one it actually is. 6 million years ago, give or take, and long before anything resembling a human existed to argue about the difference. The instinct to patrol a fixed edge and defend it with coordinated violence was already running quietly in the blood of a shared ancestor. 4,500 years ago, two rival Sumerian cities finally agreed to carve that same instinct into stone, on a single strip of farmland that neither one could actually afford to lose. 378 years ago, a room full of exhausted diplomats in two German cities decided, formally, that a border could be sacred, a fixed line, not simply a living relationship. 141 years ago, fewer than 20 men in Berlin decided that same sacred line could be drawn with nothing more than a ruler, across a flat paper map, by people who had never once set foot on the actual ground they were busy dividing. Which means the single most solid, most permanent-seeming fact in almost anyone's daily life, the one printed plainly on a birth certificate, a passport, a driver's license, is, by the honest standards of this particular story, barely finished drying.